views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of Bronxnet or the program underwriters.
All right, coming up on this edition of Today's Verdict, online predators lurk every day on common social media sites. On set today is an expert who will help you safely navigate the web without falling victim to hidden dangers. Next up, a slip and fall accident seems simple. A person trips or slips and gets hurt. But proving liability is not as easy as you would think. We will discuss this specific area of the law with an attorney in studio. And finally, if you are currently on probation, you know how difficult it can be to make sure you do not violate the conditions and end up back in prison. But what if there are hidden traps? An attorney will be here for much needed insight. Our show deals with unseen dangers that you should avoid. And as you can see, we have much to get to. So stay tuned. Today's Verdict starts right now. All right, hello and welcome to Today's Verdict, the live and interactive show that gives you your legal rights and options. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. Well, Today's Verdict is always encouraging you to stay connected to us. Make sure to tweet us at Today's Verdict and hashtag Ask Today's Verdict if you have a question. Also, make sure to like us and follow us on Facebook at Today's Verdict and check us out at Bronxnet.tv. Well, the online world isn't as safe or as private as you might believe. Joining us today to give us some tips on how to protect yourself while on the web is attorney Richard Newman. Richard, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Richard, let's just take, for example, I decided I wanted to go on the web and secure a loan for whatever particular reason. I get on and poof, there's a nice little box, a couple of pages long. I start scrolling through. I assume I'm supposed to read this box. It's a privacy protection.
Correct.
Does this always come up? Should it come up? What do you do when you see it?
Well, consumers and users that computer users that interact with web forums should read website terms and privacy statements
They're so long. I mean, they seem like they take pages and pages and pages.
They tend to be a little bit long. Many believe that shorter privacy policies would be more effective, but they're critical for users to read before they submit any of their personal information so that they understand how their information is collected, who it's shared with, and how third parties first and third parties may actually use that information.
Right, and the information you're going to be putting in, I assume if you're going to be applying for a loan, is your name, maybe your social security number, someplace you may have some bank accounts or something else. So you're going to know what exactly is going to be shared with anybody else. So that's why this privacy policy would be so important.
Correct. Users that fill out web forms, whether it's for loans or insurance or educational opportunities, for instance, will submit personally identifiable information such as name, telephone number, email address, etc. And this type of sharing of information amongst website operators and third parties is actually heavily regulated by both the state and the federal government.
And by the way, how does this differ from what's, say, a disclosure? What exactly is a disclosure as opposed to, say, a privacy policy?
Well, typically disclosures are located on a website, usually at the bottom of a website, although those that regulate the advertising industry make it clear that disclosures should be clearly and conspicuously stated, or displayed, I should say. But usually disclosures contain material terms such as conditions, limitations, or exclusions that pertain to a particular product or service, things that are important for a consumer to understand.
Now, I know in your practice you generally represent the marketers. Are there common mistakes that sometimes you can see your clients may fall into, things that you protect them to make sure that there's not an issue? Is it the privacy policies, the disclosures, both, something else really?
Oftentimes it's the conspicuousness of disclosures or the failure to properly inform consumers with respect to how their data is going to be used, who it's going to be shared with. And in terms of privacy policies, oftentimes marketers find themselves in trouble for misstating, either intentionally or unintentionally, how they protect and use information.
What are the type of things that you should be worried about, if not necessarily the marketer, but from the average viewer who's watching and is putting their information onto the site? Are they worried that that there's going to be spam emails that go out, that there's going to be other ways that they're going to use their information that may come back to harm them? What's the biggest thing that they worry about, really?
Right. Well, again, consumers need to look at the privacy policies before they click agree or check a box to understand how the website operator is going to be using that information. Is it going to be shared with a third party? Is a user consenting to receive emails? Are they consenting to receive telemarketing phone calls? So, if you don't read the privacy policy and you just submit your information, you're not going to know how your personal data is going to be disseminated.
Is there actual legislation that is governing this type of area of the law? Is there a difference between state, federal, something else?
With respect to data use?
Yes, yes.
Data use is heavily regulated,
Yes.
depending on the type of data, whether it's financial related data, that is regulated, and both state and federal regulatory authorities, either state attorneys general or the Federal Trade Commission, for example, or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, does actively police the way that information is shared amongst third parties.
All right, let's talk about protecting our children, all right, and make sure they're protected when their information somehow gets on a site. Talk a little bit about the COPA rule, if you could.
Sure. Hot issue right now, privacy and data security, especially when we're talking about data breaches or children's information. We can take COPA, for example. That was enacted in 2013 by Congress and the Federal Trade Commission. Essentially what that rule does is it's intended to put control of the use of minor children's information in the hands of parents. So children under 13 years of age whose information is collected by a website operator or an online service has to obtain verifiable parental consent and make transparent disclosures with respect to the way the information is collected.
I mean, do we see issues with this where a child somehow skirts their parents' permission and gets on themselves and gives certain information? Is that why this was enacted to begin with, really?
Well, I'm sure that does happen, but the requirement for verifiable parental consent is a little flexible from a regulatory perspective, but website operators are required to take reasonable measures to ensure that they're dealing with the parent.
What's the biggest tip you can give a parent right now if they're watching and they think that their child may be going on to a particular site and giving out the household name and the kitchen sink? What would you say, really, to a parent who's watching right now?
Monitor your children's computer use. Know what websites that they're interacting with, and
Are there certain sites that target children maybe more than others?
Well, the rule is actually designed for websites that are designed for children, either in substance or content. And those are the sites that are covered by the COPA rule if they collect personal information from children. More general audience websites are covered by the COPA rule only if they knowingly collect information from minor children.
And we don't have too much time left, so where do we find you if we have to reach out, if there's an issue?
HinchNewman.com or FTCDefenseLawyer.com, on Twitter at FTC Law Defense.
And I know, Richard, this is definitely an area of the law that keeps changing and moving, and hopefully you'll come back and give us an update fairly soon.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, we have to take a quick break, but don't worry, we'll be back with more Today's Verdict right after this.
How can I help my daughter with her reading?
Searching for help with Dachshund Reading.
No.
Let me try. Sarah's bright, but when she's reading, she has trouble sounding out words.
Playing world music.
What?
I give up.
Wait, I was trying to show you how Sarah feels every day. Frustrating, isn't it? Redirecting to understood.org.
Join parents and experts at understood.org, a free online resource about learning and attention issues to help your child thrive.
Welcome back to Today's Verdict. I'm your host, David Lesch. We are always encouraging you to stay connected. Tweet us at Today's Verdict. Slip and fall accidents can happen anywhere, from work, home, outside, or inside. The law governing this type of accident can be confusing. We now learn more with attorney Nissen Fogel. How are you doing today?
Good.
All right, well, there's a difference between a slip and fall and a trip and fall. Most people think it's the exact same thing, but it's not. Why don't you start us off that way? What's the difference?
Well, a trip and fall accident will occur generally when there's a defect in the sidewalk, in the flooring. Your toe catches a crack, a raised portion of the sidewalk, a raised grate in the sidewalk. As you're entering a building, perhaps the saddle is raised, was not fastened down. So you trip, your foot makes contact with something, and down you go. A slip and fall accident generally occurs when there's a slippery substance, whether it's rain, which wasn't, as you're entering a vestibule, and there are no mats there during a rainstorm. Failure to put down the mat. Down you go. Snow and ice, same scenario.
Same scenario. That would be more of a slip than a trip. Right?
Yeah, and that's where your foot actually comes out from under you and down you go.
Now, I know with respect to just the law itself, in terms of proving these types of cases, really comes down to notice, right? Making
Absolutely.
sure that there's notice. What do we
Critical.
mean? What do we mean by notice, really?
How much time the defective condition which caused your accident actually existed before the time of your accident. The law is very clear on this. No matter who you are, whether you're an apartment owner, whether you're a store owner, whether you're the city of New York, how much time did that ice, did that water, did that defect in the sidewalk exist before your accident occurred?
And by the way, it's very important. I'm glad you mentioned the city of New York, but there are different rules when you're bringing an action against the city of New York for, let's say, that we're talking about trips and falls. Am I correct? Why is it different than just tripping inside of a private homeowner's building? Why is it different when you sue the city of New York?
Well, actually, the city council did the consumers a huge favor a number of years ago when they made the adjoining landowner responsible for the repair and maintenance of the sidewalk. If the city is no longer responsible for sidewalks or are adjacent to a multiple dwelling less than 4 families.
So there will be times though that the city would be or could be responsible.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake. They are still responsible only for sidewalks. Only for sidewalks that are adjacent to dwellings of less than 3 families.
Okay, so if they are responsible, right, which obviously can happen, do you still have the normal time to bring a lawsuit against the city for this trip and fall, or is it a shorter
No, nothing else was
time?
changed except for who's now responsible for the repair and maintenance of the accident. You still have to file your notice of claim within 90 days.
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about. What do we mean in terms of a notice of claim? What exactly does somebody have to do to make sure that they have a claim against the city of New York?
They have to answer 5 simple questions.
Okay.
It's who you are, where you live, what the nature of the claim is, how the accident happened. And then you sign off on it. Either you give it to the city attorneys at 100 Church Street, right, or you bring it to 1 Center Street, and you file it in room 1200.
All right. Now let's get back to the slip and falls, because the slip and falls always seems to be a little bit of a tougher case to prove, because showing how long something may be sitting around for before you've got injured may be a little difficult. Let's say you're in a supermarket and somebody drops a couple of grapes right before you get to the produce aisle. You can't really hold the supermarket responsible. It's only been 2 seconds. The grapes fell on the floor, right? Do you find this happens with the slip and fall accidents?
Well, more often than not. All these cases are judged by the reasonable person standard, meaning what would a reasonable supermarket do if there was a spill on the floor? Now, obviously, if you know about it and you ignore it, you're going to be responsible. But how do you establish that the property owner knew about it? Well, you could have entered the store, gone down that aisle. A half hour later, you're going back down the same aisle, and down you go. Or you have a friend who was shopping with you, who you met in the store, and they said, "Sure, I noticed that spill on this, and it was there for 15, 20 minutes, a half hour."
Many times, I would assume your clients would also want to see if, is there video footage? Is there something that saw me fall because they said it didn't really happen, or that shows that it was on the floor for a while? But do you ever really get that kind of footage?
More often than not, that's wishful thinking.
It is.
Yeah, you never get. It's a rarity that that there's a video camera down the very aisle that you slipped and fell.
Okay, so let's say, you know, hypothetically, I've had this slip and fall or trip and fall, and I hopefully have gotten to you. What's the first thing you're doing? Is there things you're getting from me? Am I, am I taking pictures? Am I giving you something? Tell me what usually happens during that.
Terrific
that
question,
time.
and I'll tell you why. The first defense by the insurance company is, how do you know what happened in my store? How do you know what happened in my building? It's critical, which a lot of people don't. It's critical that you report the accident. If you fall in a supermarket, you fall in a department store, report the accident to a store employee. And get a copy of the accident report. And let them get your name, how it happened, the time of day, and what your injury was. And of course, sometimes some injuries don't manifest themselves right away. That's okay. But you just tell them, if your leg is killing you and that's what's hurting, you tell them that. And if there was something on the floor, you tell them there was something on the floor. You don't have to describe exactly what it is. But you have to put them on notice that you were in an accident so they can't come back later and say, how do we know? You fell in the store? How come you didn't tell anybody?
Now, are there certain restrictions? Let's say it was an employee of the store and the employee ended up getting injured. But let's say it was an employee of the supermarket. Now they want to sue their employer because they slipped and fell. Or are there times where you can't? You're not going to be able to bring a lawsuit for them.
Exactly. An employee can never sue their employer
that would be workers'
under the workers'
compensation.
comp law in New York State.
All right, well. Okay,
So
it's
you're
not-
going to be it's an on-the-job injury. Your exclusive remedy is workers' compensation.
Now, in your vast experience between the slip and falls and the trip and falls, do either one take longer than the other one to eventually get, either they settle the case or it gets tried, or they just basically work the same?
Yeah, there's no distinction between in terms of resolving the claim, whether it's a trip and fall or a slip and fall. It depends on the insurance company that you're dealing with. That's the most important. If it's an insurance company that looks to resolve things quickly, your case will settle that much later, sooner rather. If it's an insurance company that defends these cases and will never offer you a dime until you're at the time of trial, is it going to take that much longer?
And in terms of, and this is something that I've always wrestled with in terms of trials, the demonstrative evidence, what you're using to prove your case at trial. Do you blow up the pictures? What's the best evidence you use? And I'm not talking about the injury. I'm talking more about the actual accident itself. What do people like to see? Do you bring the brick in that's cracked? Do you bring in the substance that was on the? What do you do really? What helps you?
You're never going to bring in this. If it's a slip and fall, you're never going to bring in the water. You're never going to bring in the mayonnaise jar that fell or whatever liquid was on the floor, because that's going to be, first of all, you're in pain. You want to get
or
your
the
medical
video
treatment.
or whatever. Anything.
If you're fortunate enough to get a video, if there's a video, that's great. But that is such a rarity. It's not worth our time discussing. However, but if it's a crack, if it's a defective sidewalk, defective flooring, then you need your investigator to get out there and take pictures immediately, and it must be done immediately, because for all you know, the next day they're going to hear that there was an accident on the floor. Boom, there's a construction crew out there fixing the sidewalks, fixing the floor.
And the most important thing is, where do we find you?
Oh, our office is located at 299 Broadway in New York City. Our telephone number is 212-385-1122, and our website is nsfogel.com.
All right, that's all you need. All right, thank you very much, and you come back, right?
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
All right, we have to take a quick break, but don't worry, we'll be back with more of today's verdict right after this.
And I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, she keeps me warm. 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 She keeps me warm.
We are neighbors and best friends.
I love my sister.
My heart doesn't see race. Love is love.
Our family is no less than any other family.
Love is kind. Love is patient.
All right, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host, David Lesch. We are always encouraging you to stay connected. Tweet us at today's verdict. A probation violation can happen anytime. The question is, what happens when you are not made aware of the conditions by your parole officer? Well, joining us today to give us a few tips is attorney Paul Petrus. Paul, you're talking to somebody who doesn't do any criminal work, so I was really excited to kind of get into this a little bit. First of all, I took parole, I was talking probation. There's a difference, am I correct?
Yes, there is.
What's the difference between both?
So the difference is probation is when a person's been convicted of a crime and receives a term of probation instead of a period of incarceration. Parole is a person's been convicted of a crime, sentenced to prison, and then receives a term of parole, as in getting out early, or as what's called supervised release.
Okay, so big difference. So let's start with probation. You're lucky enough to get probation and not be incarcerated. What, in your experience as a criminal defense attorney, tell me some of the types of probation guidelines that somebody may get in lieu of actually going away.
Sure. So there's what's considered or called general conditions, and then there's what's called special conditions. Okay. And general conditions are what every probationer has to adhere to. Report regularly, submit to drug tests, maintain a job, employment, that sort of thing. And then there's what's called special conditions, and those are conditions that a judge would set that are specific to the case. So if the person's on for a drug conviction or the person has a substance abuse issue, the judge could order the person to obtain drug counseling.
When the judge tells you at first, guess what, I'm giving you a second chance, it's only going to be probation. Is this done in open court, on a record? Do you get a letter? How do you first find out what your terms of probation are?
Well, you find out at sentencing, and you sign the conditions of the court order. The court judge issues the order. You sign some conditions. Then the person typically goes to the probation department, and then they get the conditions explained to them in more detail by the probation officer.
Just one at a time. And I assume if you don't speak English, there's an interpreter, right? So you know exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, like in every court appearance, there's an interpreter. The person will sign off on the conditions in the courtroom, and then in terms of more details as to how they're supposed to be carried out, the probation officer will explain that.
Now, before we get into parole, we're still on probation. Let's say that you mess up.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't go to drug counseling. You don't show up when you're supposed to show up, or maybe it's community service and you're supposed to help out the community and help some pick up some garbage or things, and you don't do it. Do you get notified? Does somebody knock on your door? Is there a warrant? What happens then?
So typically, if it's a technical condition that's being violated, like that you've just laid out, the probation officer will warn the person, or if they've done a number of technical violations, the probation officer can charge them with a violation. They can send a summons letter, or if it's a serious number of violations, they can arrest them and bring them back to court.
They can. All right. Let's move into parole. All right. So if you violate parole, I guess sometimes you can actually be sent back to prison. So it's going to be even more important to understand what your terms of parole are.
You definitely need to understand them.
Okay, where does that come from? Does that come at sentencing? Does that come as you leave the jail? Where do you get hit with your parole guidelines?
Okay, so once the person's released on parole, in Albany, the Department of Corrections will send down what's called standard parole conditions. And then the parole officer can add special conditions to those for the individual person. So the person will get them upon reporting, and then they'll sign them prior to
Let's talk
being
about
released.
some of the general, what are the general conditions of parole?
Very similar to probation. You have to report, you have to you have to stay away from illegal substances, you have to maintain employment, very similar.
And of those general conditions, what seems to be the pitfall that most people decide they don't feel like complying with?
Well, a lot of people that are on parole have substance abuse issues. So unfortunately, they're not completely addiction-free when they're on parole, and a lot of times they relapse. So that tends to be the...
And almost you feel for them because in some respects, it's a disease. So it's hard you keep going back into the system, back in and out, back out and out.
At the cost of taxpayer and at the harm to this person and their family.
Now, let's say you violate one of the specific conditions.
Right.
All right. Supposed to stay away from, the domestic partner that you hurt or something, and you end up at the house knocking the door. When you're arrested, or if you are arrested, are you arrested for again on the underlying action? Are you arrested now as a probation violation, parole violation, both? Tell me how that works, really.
Sure. On parole, you're being violated or being charged with a violation for the condition because you had contact with the complainant in the case. Obviously, if it turns to a criminal act, if the contact was severe, if it was an assault, then the person could be charged anew in criminal court.
Again, all right. I've heard of these parole hearings, probation hearings. Who's there? We get a judge, we get a jury, we get your friends here. Who shows up at these hearings? And is there a difference?
In probation violation, you have your judge, so it takes place at a courthouse, and there's no jury. In parole, you get an administrative law judge, and in New York City, these violation hearings take place on Rikers Island.
Oh, they do?
They do.
Are you allowed counsel?
You're allowed counsel at both.
At both?
And you're supposed to have it.
And
you do.
You really should have counsel.
Oh, absolutely, and you have a right to it.
You do. Okay. What in terms of just your experience now, I'm kind of curious. Does it seem that there are more parole violations than ever? Is there more of a compliance? What do you see? Are people getting it, that second or third chance?
Well, what's happening is that there are more and more conditions being placed on offenders in both probation and parole, very technical. So what we're seeing more allegations of violations and more technical violations because the list of conditions seems to expand.
And why are we expanding them?
It's a good question. You'd have to speak to docs about that. But it's just basically to keep a keener eye on the people.
What's going
on. That's what they would tell
any tips? Last tips, let's do just parole. Okay, I got out. I don't want to violate. Give me some tips, please.
Follow the rules as best you can. If you're having some problem, if you're having a personal issue with your parole officer, you need to call a parole or probation lawyer right away, because sometimes there's ways where those issues can be resolved without being charged with a violation and before going back to Rikers.
Where do we find you?
You can find me at www.petraslaw.com. My number is 212-564-2440.
It's a good number to have just in case you get in trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us and, of course, you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you missed any part of today's show, be sure to check it out at www.bronxnet.tv. Also, remember, if there is a legal issue or topic you'd like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict, feel free to contact me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org or tweet us at Today's Verdict and make sure to hashtag Ask Today's Verdict. For myself and all of us at Today's Verdict, always remember, know your rights, know your issues, reach your verdict. We'll see you next time.